Let's talk about the filibuster.
The filibuster.
The filibuster.
The filibuster.
The filibuster has been in the news recently because of President Trump's desire to have Senate Republicans kill the filibuster.
It's time for Republicans to do what they have to do, and that's terminate the filibuster. It's the only way you can do it. And if you don't terminate the filibuster, you'll be in bad shape. We won't pass any legislation.
The so-called nuclear option. In order to bring the shutdown to a close, with just a simple majority, senators could pass a clean continuing resolution and end the shutdown without Democratic votes. But this raises a question. What is the filibuster? Simply put, the filibuster is the Senate's rule for unlimited debate. It allows a measure to be debated indefinitely until the Senate brings it to a close. In practice, the filibuster is mainly a delay and obstruction mechanism, one that has come to great use over the last decade or so. And so here I'm going to explain a bit of the history of the filibuster, how it's been used, why it's been used, and what kind of effects it's having on the country at large, on its system of government. Because I think those effects have been pretty bad, and I'm going to make a case to you that no matter what you've heard about the filibuster, you should want the filibuster to be sent to the ass bin of history. But first, a little background. The filibuster is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. It's not in Article 1. It's not spelled out anywhere in the structure of the Senate. It is instead a bit of an accident. You see, back in 1806, when he was Vice President of the United States and thus President of the Senate, Aaron Burr, yes, that Aaron Burr,
Pardon me, are you Aaron Burr, sir?
Encouraged his Senate colleagues to clean up the Senate rules, get rid of things that hadn't been used in some time. One of those things was a measure that allowed a majority of the Senate to end debate. By cleaning this up, because they thought that they already had some other mechanism that might do this, senators, again pushed on by Burr, inadvertently created a rule for unlimited debate. But it wouldn't really go into use until some decades later. In 1837, we get what is our first real filibuster, when a group of Whig senators filibuster a Democratic effort to expunge a censure of President Andrew Jackson. From here on out, this use of unlimited debate becomes part of the way the Senate works. Although it's not yet called a filibuster, that term, which comes from a Dutch word for pirate, doesn't really enter the English lexicon meaning unlimited debate and obstruction until the 1850s. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm not entirely sure how it made the transition from term for pirates to term for, I guess, legislative maneuvering. I guess you could imagine hijacking legislative rules to obstruct something, but that doesn't even quite work. It enters the lexicon in the 1850s and stays there. It is worth saying that for a time there was a House filibuster. It didn't work the same way. Instead, quorums in the House used to rely on not members who were present, but members who were present and voting. You should be able to see where this goes. If you are present but decide not to vote, then you're technically not part of the quorum. And without a sufficient quorum, the House couldn't act. And so there was this disappearing quorum that acted as a filibuster. The House got rid of this in the middle of the 19th century. Once it started getting abused, they nixed this pretty quick. Filibuster use begins to really increase after the Civil War. That's because this is an age of real partisan polarization. The Senate has also gotten larger, so there's just more opportunities for debate. It's doing more stuff. One of the most prominent filibusters of this period comes in 1890, when Democrats filibuster what's called the Force Bill, a piece of legislation designed to protect voting rights for Black Americans in the South. The use of the filibuster, as relatively infrequent as it is still immensely frustrating. And so in 1917, after decades of this, we get our first effort at filibuster reform. President Woodrow Wilson wants the Senate to allow merchant ships to arm in the face of unlimited German submarine warfare, and a group of Republican senators filibuster the bill, killing it. Wilson takes his appeal to the public, which responds positively. The Senate obstructionists are denounced for their efforts, people are burned in effigy, and the press refers to Wilson's demands for the Senate to reform the filibuster as a war measure. This is enough to get the Senate to act, and it adopts what's called Rule 22, or cloture. The compromise was a 2/3 majority of the Senate was necessary for cloture. But this too was a very high barrier, in which you see that cloture just doesn't happen very often. Filibusters are still mostly successful. It's here as well that we get the modern image of a filibuster, the one seen in movies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with Jimmy Stewart.
And this same man, Mr. James Taylor, came down here and offered me a seat in this Senate for the next 20 years if I voted for a dam that he knew and I knew was a fraud. But if I dared to open my mouth against that dam, He promised to break me in two. All right, I got up here and I started to open my mouth, and the long and powerful arm of Mr. James Taylor reached into this sacred chamber and grabbed me by the scruff of the neck.
President, a point of order.
Mr. President.
A lone senator standing on the floor, speaking, taking up space, slowing the Senate's business to a halt to make a principled stand. Of course, many of these principled stands were around killing civil rights bills and anti-lynching bills, but we'll get to that a little later. The sheer force of Lyndon Johnson's personality in the White House, as well as the large Democratic majorities and sizable proportion of liberal Republicans, meant that the filibuster wasn't too much of an issue in the 1960s. But it would rear its head again, and senators, tired of the obstruction of the filibuster, adopt another set of changes in the 1970s to reduce the power of the filibuster. They do two things. They first lower the threshold for cloture from 3/4 to 3/5, so 60 votes. And then they introduce something called the two-track system, in which all the floor time is not eaten up by a single filibuster. Instead, once a bill is filibustered, it moves to a second track where it can be considered at another time, and the regular business of the Senate can continue. The two-track system allowed filibusters to happen and allowed the Senate to continue on with its business. On one hand, this was a good thing. Things wouldn't be brought to a complete stop. But on the other hand, it made filibusters more frequent, because now they didn't eat up all that time. In fact, the two-track system allowed, inadvertently, and so much of the history of the filibuster is these inadvertent rule changes that make new things possible, it allowed what's called the silent filibuster. If you no longer had to talk to hold the floor indefinitely, then you could just signal your intention to do a filibuster, the bill or what have you is moved to the second track and people move on to other business. The emergence of the silent filibuster causes filibuster use to explode. In modern practice then, just the threat of a filibuster has been enough to stop a bill from proceeding any further. But it should be said that there were still relatively few cloture votes between the emergence of the two-track system and the 60-vote threshold in the 1970s and basically the early 2000s. There were more than had come before, but again, relatively few. The real transformation of the filibuster and the emergence of what you could call the routine filibuster comes in 2009. When Barack Obama enters office, Democrats have large majorities in the House and Senate, and Republicans in the minority are looking for a way to stymie a quite ambitious set of agenda items.
Our top political priority over the next 2 years should be to deny President Obama a second term.
It's here that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell introduces an innovation. An almost general filibuster on everything that comes to the floor. I'll put this a different way. There have been more than 2,500 cloture votes since 1917, since the introduction of the cloture rule. More than half of those have occurred in the last 15 years. What the routine filibuster means is that the Senate now operates on a de facto 60-vote rule. If things can get past cloture, then they can pass by majority vote. Most forms of legislation you can imagine, let's say a bill codifying Roe v. Wade or a bill to restore the Voting Rights Act, would fall under normal Senate rules and thus would be subject to the 60-vote threshold. The great consequence of the routine filibuster has been to slow Senate business to a halt. The Senate simply does not pass legislation like it used to 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 60 years ago. It is to a great extent an inert chamber. And that becomes even worse when you have members of the Senate who just aren't that interested in legislating, when you have a Senate structure that puts a lot of power and influence into leadership, or when you have presidents who are more interested in doing executive orders than trying to pass a legislative agenda. Before we get any further into implications of the routine filibuster, let's talk a little bit about some of the myths surrounding the filibuster. I already mentioned one of those myths, that the filibuster is in the Constitution. If anything, the framers would have been appalled at the emergence of the routine 60-vote requirement, because one of the precipitating factors behind the creation of the Constitution was the supermajority requirement in the Articles of Confederation. You can read in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton in particular, railing against the fact that to accomplish anything under the Articles, you needed 9 of 13 states to agree. This supermajority requirement in the Articles left that government effectively unable to act. And it was its inability to act in the face of foreign threats and economic crises that led many elites of the time to gather in Philadelphia to create the Constitution. And in defending the Constitution and advocating for it during the ratification debates, both Hamilton and Madison were clear that although their system was filled with veto points and counter-majoritarian mechanisms, when things came to a head in Congress, it would operate according to majority rule, what they called the Republican principle, lowercase r. Which brings us to the next myth: the filibuster has been used to protect the interests of minorities. And this is true depending on how you define minorities. When people say this, they tend to be speaking with a silent, vulnerable minorities. And that isn't true. If anything, it's been just the reverse. At various times in this country's history, there have been working majorities to try to ban lynching, pass new voting rights or civil rights laws, and to expand the rights of millions of Americans who have been under the boot of oppression. And the filibuster has been used in those moments to either stymie and stifle those efforts or kill them outright. I already mentioned the 1894 bill, which would have federalized election administration in the South, protecting black voters from the ravages of vigilante white supremacists. Multiple anti-lynching bills in the early 20th century were killed by Senate filibuster. And some of the most famous segregationists in our nation's history filibustered civil rights bills in 1957 and 1964. More than anything, the filibuster has been used to protect the interest of a powerful minority, of segregationists and the leaders of lynch mobs. In fact, as far as separate discussions to have, there's a whole discussion to have about the value of supermajority rules to begin with. Do they actually serve to protect people, or do they simply serve to make it impossible to govern, or to change existing systems of government? But again, separate conversation for another video. You would be hard-pressed to look at American history and in fact find any example of the filibuster being used for good. Instead, the filibuster is usually the tool of powerful obstructionist forces in our government. Which brings us to the present. Implications of the filibuster. The idea of unlimited debate is nice, I suppose. But the purpose of the Senate is not simply to chat, to yap. The purpose of the Senate is to legislate, to do the business of government. The purpose of the Constitution is to have a workable system for self-government. And if the system isn't workable, no matter how much consensus it encourages, then the system needs to be changed. And I think you can say that for the filibuster. The filibuster has not protected minorities. It has not enhanced compromise. It has not done anything of the sort. If anything, the filibuster has made compromise less likely. Think of it this way. If you know a bill just needs 50 or 51 votes to pass, if you know it might be a done deal, then you might want to get in on the action. You might want to get input into what happens. You might want to participate in the amendment process. You might want to participate in the negotiations. The train is moving and you want to get on it. You don't want your interests left out. But if the threshold is 60 votes, or in the past 67 votes, and you know that's almost never going to be reached, then why would you bother? Why wouldn't you just be in the opposition the entire time? And on the flip side, if you are crafting the bill, you're going to be looking for as much partisan unity as you can, which means you're going to be negotiating within your own tent, not with others outside of it. Far from encouraging any kind of bipartisanship or compromise, the filibuster has led to more partisan legislation when there's any legislation at all. In the absence of actual legislating, the absence of governing has, in my view, completely distorted the way Congress and the American system of government is supposed to work. The filibuster has led Congress to an almost 15-year-long gridlock. It is incredibly difficult to do anything. But things still need to be done. Events keep happening. Issues keep arising. The public wants a government that works. And if Congress can't do anything, then other branches attempt to pick up the slack. Judges begin to do de facto lawmaking, and presidents begin issuing executive orders, treating them less as guidance for those agencies and more as attempts to circumvent existing law.
And I've said time and time and time again to Congress that send me the DREAM Act, put it on my desk, and I will sign it right away. Now, both parties wrote this legislation, and a year and a half ago, Democrats passed the DREAM Act in the House, but Republicans walked away from it. It got 55 votes in the Senate, but Republicans blocked it. The bill hasn't really changed. The need hasn't changed. It's still the right thing to do. The only thing that has changed, apparently, was the politics.
I do not think you get the unilateral actions of this president, or the one before him, or the one before him, or the one before him, without the emergence of the routine filibuster. And regardless of where your politics lie, I think you should want a government where Congress is doing most of the work, where Congress is legislating, where representative government is actually taking place, rather than one where we have to essentially rely on an elected dictator.
I alone can fix it.
Or a set of judges who have very little connection to what the public and the people generally want. The filibuster ought to just be a historical curiosity, but what it is instead is one of the things that is actively destroying our system of government. I'd like to see it go away, and I think you would like to see it go away as well. All right, that's it for our little history of the filibuster. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know what you'd like me to cover as part of this nerd stuff series. I like talking about this stuff, and I like sharing this information with you. So please let me know what you want to hear.